This is video 7C in the SQL series and is entitled Stored Procedures with Arguments in MySQL. I'm Dr. Renaud from Shawnee State University, and I'll be taking you through this brief video presentation. In the previous video presentation, we saw the process of creating a simple stored procedure, but that's not going to do all the things that stored procedures can do. One of the things that really makes stored procedures extremely powerful is the ability to send data into the stored procedure or pass values into the procedure and potentially get values back from the procedure into your variables. So this presentation is going to be about complex stored procedures. You'll see how to pass arguments to a stored procedure and call a procedure that way, and how to extract arguments or values back from a stored procedure. You'll see the use of insert and delete and select statements inside the stored procedure to really make a stored procedure just extremely powerful. So if we take the simple stored procedure that we created in the last video, where we created a report for our salesman in Texas to show all customers in Texas with their last shipment dates, you can see that we've modified the stored procedure now to be called cust in state, and we're going to pass it the arg state, which is a variable, sort of like a variable, but it's a stored procedure variable. So the arg state will be passed in the call, and then arg state will be used, you see, in the where clause, so that the stored procedure will generate for any salesman in any single state. So you can see that we can cust in state NY, and NY is then sent into the stored procedure where it's used in the where clause to generate a report for New York customers with sales. It makes it a much more generic, much more general stored procedure that can be used by lots of people. For instance, here is another stored procedure where we create a stored procedure called add shipment that takes three values. It takes the shipment ID number, it takes the customer ID as an integer, and it takes the shipping cost as a decimal number, and starts a transaction, inserts it, and commits. Notice that I use different names for the variables coming in: ship ID, cust ID, and ship, so that in the SQL statement, so that in the insert statement, it doesn't get confused between, is it shipment ID or the argument sent into the stored procedure. So that's why I use different names in the definition of the stored procedure than exists in the table columns that we're adding it. But you can see the use of those argument variables in the insert statements, in the insert statement. You could also have done multiple insert statements if you'd have needed to. Here's another stored procedure that uses both in arguments as well as out arguments. Take a look at the definition, how we defined system ID or item ID in, and we defined the variable markup out. Take a look at the select statement where we calculate markup. We do price minus cost divided by cost. And there's that new word you've not seen before, into, that causes the result of that select to be stored into the variable of the create procedure, the stored procedure variable, or the stored procedure argument variable, so that markup could be returned. Notice down below where we call it by saying call item markup with an item number, and the variable at m now contains the markup returned from the stored procedure. And by saying select at m, or doing whatever we're going to do with it, we can do that with subsequent SQL statements using the variable at m to represent the markup calculated when we called item markup. That was a really brief introduction to complex stored procedures, but I think if you take what you know about SQL and creating transactions and updating and inserting, that should have made a lot of sense. That should be pretty easy to follow. If you have any questions, don't hesitate to contact me at jrenaud at shawnee.edu. This presentation is copyright 2021 by me, James Renault, PhD. This is all rights are reserved. This work is licensed under Creative Commons Attribution Share Alike 4.0 non-commercial license. And I'd like to say thank you for watching, and I hope to see you again in another presentation.